Recently, you might have seen me guest on Matthew Jensen's channel when he was doing a live stream to do a tier list of katana makers. We were also joined by Kane Shen and Joe and Andy from Darksword Swords. And after that, we kind of were talking and decided it'd be really cool to do a Euro Sword tier list as well. And we spent a few days coming up with how we wanted to do this and also coming up with the list of different makers. And it kind of was settled on we'd each make our own list and then maybe do a live stream all together to discuss our own lists, where we differ, where we feel the same. So first up, here is my video on Euro Sword tier list. Now, I want to say, like I said, we spent a few days trying to come up with a list of makers. I am 100% positive that we missed somebody or some company very obvious, and I apologize for that. It's actually a lot harder than you might think to come up with all available Euro Sword makers just off the top of your head. So if we missed somebody, I apologize for that. Now, I want to talk about how I'm going to rank these makers, because I think I'm going to be a little bit different than anybody else on the stream. For the number one thing I'm going to do that I don't think anybody else is going to do is S tier is the best, and I will not put a maker in there if I have no experience with them or if I only have experience with one of their swords. I need to see consistency in my own experience with them to be able to consider them truly S tier. So the best a company or a person can be is A tier if I've only got experience with one of their swords. It's just my personal criteria. I think S tier should really be reserved for the absolute cream of the crop that is consistently great, as well as great in individual swords. My personal opinion, like I said, I am confident the other people who are doing this are not going to share that same opinion, and that's fine. The other little bit of prep on this is that there are a lot of makers on here that I have no experience with. And as far as I can tell, with only one exception, they're all going to be dumped right into the NA category, because I'm not going to talk about reputation. I'm going to talk about my experience with those makers' swords. So if I don't have experience, I don't have anything intelligent to add to the conversation. And finally, this is not just like the best sword is automatically S tier. The best quality is automatically S tier. Value plays a definite part here. It's not fair to say that a maker who costs $10,000 is an S tier, while somebody, just because their swords are superb, while there's a maker who does a $200 sword that is also excellent, but is not as excellent as that $10,000 sword. It's really hard to compare the two of them. It's very subjective, but just know that value for what you get for your money is definitely part of my judging criteria. And of course, this entire concept is just for fun. Everybody has their own opinions, and there's no wrong opinions on how much you value what you value in getting in a sword. It's all subjective. So with all those disclaimers and qualifiers and explanations out of the way, let's get into the meat of the video and start ranking these different makers. And we're going to start with Albion. I really don't think it is any surprise to anybody that I am putting them in S tier. Albion is consistently outstanding quality. Sure, they might have a few flaws here and there. Sometimes they don't come sharp enough. There's some finish issues occasionally where I think they could do better polish, but their swords are incredibly well researched, incredibly well designed, incredibly well created, and they are an absolute joy to own, to experience. Even if it's not a sword that I particularly like, I can still appreciate the level of craftsmanship and thought that went into the design and acknowledge that not every sword is right for every person. So we're starting right off with Albion at S tier, and if you're surprised, you have not been watching my channel. Next up is Angel Sword, and while I have a tiny bit of experience with them with one sword at Valley of the Sun, it's not nearly enough experience to say anything, so they go into NA. Next up is Angus Trim, and once again, S tier. Again, I don't think this is any surprise to anybody. Now, his S tier ranking is very different from Albion because his swords are not nearly as aesthetically pleasing as Albion to me or to most people. Some people probably do like the look better, and that's okay. But Angus Trim swords are laser focused on performance and handling and incredibly refined feel, and they are top notch in that regard and very consistent. Just absolute joy once again to handle, to wield, and to move around. So S tier. Next up is Arms and Armor. Now I have one experience with one sword of theirs, and I also have one of their axes. The sword I sold several years ago, my experience with it was good, but it was also pretty early in my knowledge of swords. So it's kind of hard to rank them based off my experience. Now, because I only have experience with one sword, I do have the axe, but I have not used it at all. It's just sat in my closet, frankly. Eventually I'll get around to reviewing it, but I really only have experience with one sword. So they are they're ineligible to be in S tier according to my system. Their reputation would probably put them in either A or S. In my experience, I'm going to put them in A. I don't think I would put them up in S even if I had more experience, because their aesthetic doesn't really speak to me. There's a lot of their swords that I just don't really like the look of, and that's just my personal taste. But still, A tier, a very good ranking. Next up, we have the Art of Fire and Iron. No experience, so NA. This next one is going to be very, very tricky, and that's Balaur Arms. And it's very tricky because it's not a consistent brand. It has been made by 3 different companies, and I would rank each of them separately. Actually, I would rank the original Balaur Arms, which was made by OTC, as probably a B tier, in that driven almost exclusively by the value proposition. But the next iteration, which was by Winless, I have next to no experience. I had one sword from them, and it was a little better in some ways, a little worse. Probably B tier there as well. That one could dump down into C tier depending on how much I deducted points for the fact that the sword I had from that had a dip in the blade, a grinding error that caused it to take a set. Regardless, how I'm going to judge it now is as it is now, with LK Chen as the maker. And where I'm going to put that is B tier. And I think this is going to be a little bit controversial. The reason I'm not putting them in A tier, I think some of other people would put them in A tier. And the reason I'm putting them in B is because of consistency. I have not had particularly good luck with consistency on the LK Chen made Balaur Arms swords. The edge sharpening in particular has been very inconsistent. And the Italian longsword that I had, the first one that LK Chen made for Balaur Arms, I think some of the changes to the design weren't the best. So I'm putting them in B tier, but I think it's very possible that they will bump up to A tier if they can improve their consistency, and presuming LK Chen continues making for Balaur Arms. Next up is Baltimore Knife and Steel, BKS, no experience. Black Fencer, no experience, with a caveat in that I got to handle one of their sharp swords at SoCal Sword Fight. It's the sword that Philip Martin took gold with in arming sword competition, and I believe I'm going to be ordering one of them pretty soon. So I will have some experience with it pretty soon, I think. Next up is Brian Kerce. And I do have some experience with him in that I owned one of his very early Celtic swords that he made, but it was such an early sword from him that I don't think it was representative of what he actually makes now. So I don't feel comfortable giving him any kind of ranking based on that specific sword. Next up, Carlos Cordeiro. Again, no experience. Pictures that I've seen, utterly gorgeous, but I don't have any actual experience with him. All right. And so I said, if I don't have experience with a sword maker, I'm not going to rank them, with one exception. Here is the exception. Castle Keep, aka Rob Miller. I rank him as F because what I have seen of him is that he has loathsome views as a person, in that he has thanked for support and inspiration notorious Holocaust denier Gerard Menuhin. I guarantee I pronounced that wrong. I will put sources to this information in the description. I can't tolerate such views. I will never support Castle Keep. You will never see a Castle Keep sword on this channel. This is my line in the sand. So I put him in F tier based on what I consider his absolutely loathsome views. Next up is Cloudhammer Steelworks, and I'm putting them in C tier. Now, I think they make very good katanas. I think their swords, their Euro swords, are lacking. The longsword, bastard sword, hand and a half sword I had, I don't think the design was up to snuff. It didn't really have the right design for pretty much anything. It was a very thrust-focused sword, but the tip was way too thin, and it ended up bending during some pretty mild tests. And the cord wrap on the grip was awful. It needed to be replaced. I think they have potential. They are one of the very few companies that will work with more advanced steels, and I'm guessing that with some guidance, they could make good swords. And it's not that that was a terrible sword, it just needed the design needed more refinement. I think with refinement, they could move up. But for now, I would say C tier, and honestly, low C, because their Euro swords are very expensive. You're looking at $600 to $800, and you're not really getting that good of a deal. So I could be persuaded to put them into D, but I think I'm going to stick with C. Next up is Cold Steel, and this one is tricky because some of Cold Steel is very good and some of Cold Steel is very bad. I have had good experience with Cold Steel Euro swords, but that's because I have generally gone for the models that have good reputations. I've seen a lot of stuff that their reputation is not good. But again, I'm going based on what I have experience with. So I'm actually going to put them all the way up into B because the swords I've had from them have been very effective swords at a good price. And no, they're not the prettiest, but I think that deserves a B ranking. Next up is Crown Forge. And this is Eric McHugh. Now, he does not actually, he closed his forge, so you can't really find anything new from him. But if you find stuff on the open market, he would most likely be in S tier if I had more experience with him. I have one sword from him. It is absolutely lovely. Eventually, I will get around to reviewing it, but my basic impression so far is that he is outstanding. Next up is Historical Sword Zone, or Damian Sulowski. Again, I only have experience with one of his swords, A tier. I'm not positive I would put him in S tier even if I had another. In fact, no, I don't think I would put him in S tier if I had another of the same quality of sword as I have experience with. I do really like the sword that I have from him, but the design could be a little bit better. It could be a little bit thicker, make it a little bit less floppy. It's utterly gorgeous. He has some of the most beautiful leather work, some of the cleanest lines in a sword making. The finish is absolutely gorgeous. He makes insanely beautiful stuff, and it is very functional too. But at least the one I have, I think there is room for improvement. So I probably would put him into A tier, even if I had more experience. All right, Darksword Armory. If you watched my review of a Darksword Armory sword, I don't think you'd be surprised to see me putting them in F tier. The sword I reviewed was an absolute disaster, and I don't need to reiterate everything that happened. Just go watch the review if you want to know why I'm putting them in F tier. Next up is Darkwood Armory. No experience. They make rapiers mostly, but from what I know, I don't have any experience. Deepeeka. I don't actually really have experience. I've had a few Deepeeka objects from like Cult of Athena mystery boxes, but they were already munitions grade, already worn down heavily. Not enough experience to really give a grade, so NA. Deltin, no experience. Let me check my notes. This is Dynasty Forge, no experience. Swordmakery Elgur, no experience. Ensifer, no experience. Fable Blades, no experience. Probably S, just based off reputation, but no experience. Dr. Fabrice Cognot, no experience. Gaël Fabre, no experience. Hanwei, I'm going to put them in solidly B. They have some very good designs. Actually, Hanwei Tinker Swords move them up to an A. They have some really solid designs in their Euro sword market and make some very good functional swords. Their sharpening may not be the greatest. Their consistency might be a little lacking here and there, but they overall have excellent swords at excellent prices. You cannot beat the deal of Hanwei Tinker Swords. So that actually bumps them into A tier. Pretty much, like I said, almost completely on the strength of the Hanwei Tinker line, but also one of my favorite budget longswords I've ever had was the Hanwei Albrecht II longsword. I love that sword. I miss it. I sold it a while ago. I shouldn't have. I might have to pick up another one sometime. Next up is Honshu. So this is interesting. I can really only go based off of the one Italian longsword that they sent me, which was a very well-designed sword that could have been improved considerably, but very affordable, a very nice sword. So I'm putting them in B tier based solely on their new Honshu Historical, and the way to know if it's a sword that I would consider potentially worthy of a B ranking would be to look at their designs, compare them to Balaur Arms of old, because if it's the old Balaur Arms designs, it's by the same company that made them, and I ranked those around B also. So B overall. All right, Incarius Craft, C, and this is definitely going to rub some people the wrong way. I have had two swords from him. Neither one of them really connected to me. I found the grips too small and the sword geometry a little clunky. The distal taper design was off a little bit. Everything about them just felt not quite refined enough for the price that that Incarius asks for, which is around $800 to $1,000, depending on the sword and scabbard. And then there is the experience of dealing with Incarius, which is not good. He has a terrible reputation for poor communication and awful estimates of how long things will take. And that plays into the value proposition. That plays into how you feel about a sword when you are told it's going to be done in 6 months and 18 months later it's still not done and you are begging for updates. That's going to color your opinion on the sword, and that's why I drop him into C. I will say he is absolutely capable of getting all the way up to S tier if he can improve his communication, his customer service, and improve his designs, refine them a bit more. He would absolutely make it up into S tier. All right, next up is Jeffrey Robinson. Now, some people might say Jeffrey Robinson only rehilts Albions, and that's not true. He actually does craft his own swords. Now, I only have experience with 2 swords from him, both of them remounted Albions. But the experience with those 2 are outstanding. The blades are obviously outstanding. They are Albions. But the attention to detail that Jeffrey Robinson puts into his rehilting and extending the tangs to make longer hilts, and just his understanding of how the sword works just screams absolute top tier maker. I would love to own more from him. I would love to own a sword that he has actually made completely by himself, and maybe I will someday. Everything I know about him, I say S tier. Next up is James Elmsley. For now, this is a NA. I do have a falchion that he is working on, but I don't have it yet. So I can't really say anything other than I will say he is incredibly gracious with sharing knowledge, very pleasant person to talk to, and has never once ghosted me in any way, shape, or form. If I want to update on my commission, if I just want to talk to him about something, he is always willing to talk. And that's a nice thing to have. That will, I expect, bump him up into a high tier, even if the sword lets me down, which frankly I don't expect it to. John Lindamo. So I cannot put him in S tier because I only have 1 sword by him. And honestly, the 1 sword I have by him, the Heron Mark sword, I don't have enough experience with it yet to really rank him too much. I'm putting him into a tier because I do have a sword from him. Everything I know of this sword and all the stuff I know of him says probably S tier. I'm putting him in A tier just on my initial impressions on the Heron that I have. And with the reservation that according to my rules, I can't put him in S tier. I would expect he deserves to be in S tier. I am very confident that when I get a chance to review the Heron, I'm going to love that sword. That's just my impression. Next up is Josh Davis of Davis Reproductions. I only have a little bit of experience with him in that I had 1 sword that developed some rust on the tip, and the wire wrap on the grip had come loose, and I sent the sword to him to clean up the polish, clean up that rust, and put a new wire wrap on it. And he did a great job at a very affordable price. But I don't have experience with his actual sword making, so NA. KC Lund, no experience. Kingdom of Arms, no experience. Kingston Arms. Yeah, this is going to drop all the way down to C. So I have experience with a few of their swords. I have a 13A by them. I did a review of their Type 14. I had, for a brief amount of time, 1 of their side swords. And there's been problems with all of them. And consistently had problems. The 13A, the grip wrap was terrible. The Type 14, the blade wasn't seated in the crossguard properly, causing it to come loose. The side sword, they had this little leather wrap over the ricasso that was just awful. And it was glued on. It was just awful. I don't see the consistency there that I would need to really mark them up to a B tier. I would like to be able to because I really like their designs, but I need to see more consistent improvements before I can do that. Krieger Historical, not to be confused with Krieger Armory, no experience. Kvetun Armory, no experience. Landsknecht Emporium, no experience. I want experience, but none so far. Light Swords or Yindrich Figura, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, no experience. Living History Market, no experience. LK Chen, I have to put as for Euro swords, no experience. I have experience with their Chinese swords, but not their Euro yet. Lonely Wolf Forge, which is West Beam. I don't have experience with swords from him, but I do have experience with 2 knives from him, and they were quite nice knives, very sharp, very good designs. But his prices are pretty high, especially if you look into his swords, and I'm not sure if the value is there or not. It's hard to say, but based on those knives, the value might not quite be there for me personally. So B tier, I wouldn't be surprised if I had more experience, he would move into A, but for me, B. Longship Armoury. Now, when we were discussing this, there was some confusion over whether John Lundamo is Longship Armory. And from what I understand, they have other people that make stuff for Longship as well. I don't have experience with those, so NA. Lukas Mästle-Goer. I'm, again, butchering the pronunciation. No experience. Lyndle Driggers. So, I had a falchion from him. And it didn't really speak to me. It was not very sharp. It was pretty roughly finished. It was good value. It was $400. So it wasn't a particularly expensive sword, but it just felt a little not in my wheelhouse. It didn't speak to me. So I don't think it was a bad sword particularly, although it desperately needed a better sharpening job. But it just didn't speak to me. I'm going to put him in C. I know there's people who put him higher. Maciej Kopciuch, or Art of Sword Making. This is a tricky one. I have experience with one of his swords right now, and that was a knightly arming sword that was loaned to me by my friend Steve. I have a commission with him, and that commission is now going on 8 months overdue, I believe, with very spotty communication and over-promising of when it'll be done. A lot of issues there. And the sword that I do have experience with was gorgeous. It was so beautiful. And it handled pretty well. It was not sharp enough at all to do the job. And Mr. Kopciuch has doubled and tripled down on his level of sharpness as appropriate. And I disagree. So it's really tough. In terms of pure aesthetics, he would be up in, I can't put him in S tier. I couldn't put him in S tier because I only have experience with one. But if I had more experience with more, it would be an S tier in terms of pure aesthetics. I'm not sure how much I'm going to end up docking him on here because I don't agree with his opinions on sharpness, and I find his professionalism to be lacking at times. So for me right now, he actually goes into B. I could definitely see that being A based off of how good his swords might be, but the one I had, while it was good, I didn't find it enough to overcome some of the other problems I have. Next up is Malleus Martialis Firenze. No experience. Martial Subtles. So this is another tricky one. I have one sword from Martial Subtles, and there's a lot of history in this sword, and both with how I acquired it and my experience with Mr. Subtles. My experience with Mr. Subtles has been superb. There's a lot to go on there, and I don't feel like I have enough to really give a strong opinion on him yet, other than to say that my experience with him has been excellent. He has been nothing but accommodating and gracious. And for more than that, you're going to have to wait for me to get to the review. Mateusz Sulowski. I'm going to put him in A tier. I only have experience with one sword of his, again, a loaner from Steve. And that sword did not speak to me in terms of how it handled, but it was gorgeous. It handled the way it was supposed to handle. Mateusz has, just like his brother Damian Sulowski, has just outstanding aesthetics and fit and finish. So A tier based on that, and very functional swords. Michael Tinker Pierce, I don't have experience with his exact swords. Nicholas Cocchiolo, no experience. Owen Bush, no experience. Paul Binns, no experience. Pavel Mock, no experience. Peter Johnson, I wish I had experience, but I don't. Purna Darnal. Now, this is an interesting one to talk about because commissioning something from Purna Darnal is nothing at all like commissioning from some other makers. He is not a Euro sword maker by default. He needs you to provide the design and the specifications and the guidance. He is a kukri smith who has branched out and pushed his limits and continues to push his limits and learning more about other culture swords, but he is still very much dependent on people giving him good designs. Now, what you get with a Purna Darnal sword, from everything I've seen, something very sharp, something that will match the design that you give him, something that will be very functional, but will be very rough in fit and finish and overall aesthetics. He is capable of putting out incredibly beautiful stuff, but you have to also pay for it. He used to be a lot more of a bargain than he is now. I believe commissioning a sword from him now is running upward over $1,000. So it's no longer the budget he's no longer the budget go-to for custom swords. And there's also at least some concern about his heat treatment. The Chasm falchion that I reviewed had a small set in it. And there's just enough little things that bring him down a little bit that I'm going to put him into B tier. But if you can really nail the design and he really nails things, you could get something fully S tier. Next is Regenyei, no experience. Reichhardt, no experience. Ronin Katana, here's one that's going to rub some people the wrong way. I have owned several Ronin Katana Euro swords and disliked them all. Well, no. There was one that I did like for the most part. The single-edged longsword they have is actually a pretty decent sword. I think their quality control and ability to mount the blades is a little suspect. That one had some issues there. But overall, I did like that sword. But I've owned several others that were clunky and just not fun swords to use. You do get a good price and a properly sharpened sword. So that can bump them up. And if they had decent grips, I would put them into C. But that brings me to their grips. Their Euro sword grips are atrocious. They are the least comfortable grips I have ever used, barring, once again, that single-edged longsword, which had a much more normal grip. But most of their Euro sword grips are bulbous with these thick cord texture and very squishy leather and just not good, well-designed grips. And that is, I've said this before, the grip is your interface for using the sword. And if it's not pleasant, it's not a pleasant sword to use. All right? And next up is Starfire Swords, no experience. Stephan Lockwood. So just like with Mr. Kopciuch, I have issues with Mr. Lockwood's communication skills. I think the sword that I got from him was gorgeous, masterfully made, and a joy of a sword. It would be, if I was ranking this just on the sword, he would be A tier. I couldn't put him in S tier because I only have experience with one of his swords. But it would be right up there based purely on the sword. But the communication issues, the delays, the ghosting of me, all that brings it down to a B tier. Next up is Sterling Armory. Now, this is an interesting one too, because Sterling Armory is 3 different makers. It's Chris Fields, Colton Mogg, and Josh Warbear. And I have a lot of experience with Chris's swords, a small amount of experience with Colton's and Josh's. But I'm going to rank this based on mostly Chris's, because he's kind of the face of Sterling Armory. And if you watch my channel, this is not surprising to you. Sterling Armory makes probably my favorite swords that I own consistently. Chris Fields is so consistent at making swords that are a delight to pick up and swing and use. And he also puts an incredibly effective edge on his swords. He is a cutter, and you can see that in his swords because his swords want to cut. I love every one of my Sterling Armory swords, and I guarantee I'm going to end up with more of them. All right, Swordier. So I do have a tiny bit of experience with Swordier in that a friend sent me one of their swords to review, and then I'm going to send it back to him. But all I did was unpack it and get minor impressions of it. Not nearly enough to say anything. So NA right now. Todd Cutler. I don't have experience with his swords. I have experience with his daggers. Since we're mostly talking about swords, I probably shouldn't rank him on his swords, but I did rank Lonely Wolf Forge West Beam on his based off his daggers, so I will do that on Todd Cutler. And I think they are going to be up in A tier, and this is again more about his daggers than his swords, and that is so much is based on the sheer value of his daggers. You can get you can get a lot of really cool designed daggers at a very affordable price, usually around $100 to $150. They're not, even when you pay for them to be sharpened, they're not particularly sharp, but they're daggers. They're not particularly hard to sharpen yourself or find somebody who can sharpen for you. So there's a lot of really cool designs. They're very functional. They're really, Todd Cutler is the go-to for daggers and Euro daggers. And his sword line looks pretty good, but I can't say anything about it. Todd's Workshop, A tier, and this is based off the one sword I have experience from, which was loaned to me by my friend Nate, the Rithenhilt longsword. And that sword is just so choice. It is such a beautiful sword, so well made. I don't think I would pay the price that Todd wants for that sword. So the value drops a little bit to me. In fact, looking at his swords, I don't think even if I had more experience with them, I would put him into S tier because his prices are so high that I don't think the value is quite there unless one of the swords utterly speaks to you. And they don't quite to me. So I think A tier is a very good place for him. Universal Swords. Now they mostly make sabers, and I've had some from them, but again, mystery box stuff. So not necessarily their normal quality and just not enough experience to really give a rating. Valiant Armory, S tier. Again, not really surprising. Valiant Armory does outstanding work. They are right up there with Albion and Sterling Armory and Angus Trim. They are outstanding swords, outstanding makers. They come with a scabbard, so there's good value there. And when you pick up their Vision line swords, they feel like picking up an Angus Trim sword, but they have the beauty of Valiant Armory. That is a heck of a cool thing. And it makes me excited for more and more Vision line swords. All right, Victor Berbuch, I don't know how to pronounce that. No experience. Vince Evans, no experience. Vladimir Cervenka, no experience. So winless and winless Royal Armories. This was decided to break them up because these are very, very, very different markets for winless. Winless Royal Armories is not your typical winless swords. So we figured let's break them up into two separate sections. And honestly, we could probably put some of Winless's Mastercraft collection into the Royal Armory collection too, but we're just going Royal Armory collection here. And I'm putting them in B tier because while the one sword I had from them, which was their Wakefield hanger, the falchion, it was a joy of a sword to use, but their quality control is atrocious. And this is going based off of a lot of reports. I see so many reports so often of bad quality control and swords being sent out with flaws that they should not have been sent out with. So while the sword I had would make it a A tier, the quality control and lack of consistency drops it down into B tier for me. And that brings us to winless as a whole. And I have to hover between C and D. This is a tough one. I don't really like winless that much. I find a lot of their designs to be clunky, not handled particularly well, and not designed well enough. This is just my opinion on winless. I think they are capable of making excellent swords. I think they do not put enough effort into their designs, do not refine their designs enough. But they have some new ones that they have done that on. Their 1796 Light Cavalry Saber was a joy to use. Their new Viking sword, that the name is slipping out of my mind right now, that I actually have, seems like a pretty good sword. I haven't formed a lot of opinions on it yet, but those are two models. Winless has, I don't know, hundreds of models at this point. I don't know, probably more like dozens of models, but they have a lot of models. And the fact that a lot of them are just a little clunky, a little unrefined, with not particularly good grips. Most of the time, it's usually a kind of crappy feeling leather. And then they're pretty much terrible leather sheaths. And their consistent lack of consistency and quality control. There's a good number of things that bring them down for me personally. I don't like lack of consistency. I don't like consistently being inconsistent. Winless has a consistent problem of lack of quality control, and it's what brings them down for me. They are capable, I would say, of making A-tier swords, but their consistent problems with not making A-tier swords and their continued use of designs that aren't particularly well thought out, to me, brings them down. Lastly is Winter Cutlery, which is Eric Estlund. I don't have any experience with his work right now. That might be changing this year, but I don't really know. And that's everything. So this, I was trying to blaze through these pretty quick, and I still ended up recording far more than I expected. I believe this is going to be a longer video than I wanted it to be, and I'm betting it's going to be shorter than some of the other people's. So I hope you enjoyed this tier list. Feel free to debate in the comments about what you agree with me, what you disagree with me. I know there's some things in here that people will disagree with me on, and that is perfectly fine. I hope I at least gave a good explanation for why I rank these different makers where I did. And after you finish watching this, if they're up, check out Kane Shen's channel, Matthew Jensen's channel. I think Unsheathed Sword Reviews is going to be doing this also. There's a couple different channels that are all going to be doing these tier rankings. And check them out, and then keep an eye out on one of our channels. I don't know yet. I'm guessing Matthew Jensen's for the live stream where we go over the entire thing. Until next time, Alien 2'd out.